Hi. At this point in your prep, you've probably begun to reach kind of an abstract, cerebral level. You're thinking about the science, you're strategizing about the ideas in CARS questions. But remember, the MCAT is also a physical experience. You're going to be sitting there in a room at a computer with certain tools in the test interface and certain pressures on the clock. Those sorts of physical considerations, managing around them and being ready for them is what this lesson is all about. What you're going to be able to do after you've learned everything this lesson has to offer is you're going to be able to use the tools in the MCAT interface more effectively. Think about the ones that are more useful and the ones that are less useful, and also to execute and begin practicing your own personal clock management strategy. The main focus is going to be on the facts of what the MCAT clock looks like for each section. So let's start with those CBT or computer-based test tools. On the page in your book and soon on your screen, we're going to go through the 5 major CBT tools that you'll have on test day on a continuum from ones you should use all the time at the top to ones you should be more careful about down at the bottom. But before we start, review what you already know about the tools that the MCAT gives you. They're right on the page in your book if you need a reminder of them, but which of these tools are you already familiar with? Which ones do you like to use or not like to use? Well, ultimately, wherever you are about these tools right now, you're going to evolve and be in a slightly different position by test day because there's some time between now and then, and you're going to form your own relationship on how you use these tools and how often. But here's an overview of the tools themselves and how useful they generally are. We'll be using this image of the test interface to show you where each of these tools can be found. The first tool, and this one is the most useful, you should be using it multiple times every single section, is the section review. It's the button at the bottom of the screen that says review, and it'll take you to a screen that looks like this, with every question on the section, whether you've marked it, whether you've completed it. Now, those little green check marks don't mean you got the question correct. It just means you have done the question. It would be kind of a spoiler if they just told you whether it was correct before you even finished the section. Now, this tool is extremely useful, and that's because, as you probably already know, doing an MCAT test section from the beginning to the end is one of the worst ways to move through a section, because you're letting the test control you rather than the other way around. You should be taking control of the test and the section, doing the easiest questions first and jumping around, skipping questions and coming back to them. The section review tool is exactly what's going to let you do that. The second tool, which you should definitely be using whenever it's applicable, is answer choice elimination. If you right-click on the text of an answer choice, it will cross off that answer choice in the test. These crossing offs will be saved, so potentially if you go to a question, you're able to eliminate 2 answer choices, but you're not sure of the rest. If you come back to that question later, you'll still see which ones you've eliminated. That can be really useful for triaging, but it can also just be useful to organize your thoughts. If you look at choice B and you know it's wrong, you cross it out and you never have to think about it again. Really useful tool. The third tool, which is useful certainly when it applies, but it's really only going to apply to a few questions on each exam, is the periodic table. The button is located here in the upper right of the test interface, and it's going to bring up a periodic table that looks just like the periodic table on the inside cover of your lesson book, by the way. It's going to bring up that periodic table over top of the question you're looking at the time. It's going to show you the atomic mass and atomic number of each element. When you need to use the periodic table, jot down whatever numbers you need in your scratch work, then close the periodic table and go back to the question. Don't be afraid to use this tool, but again, you'll only use it a handful of times for each exam because there are only a handful of questions that demand you know certain atomic numbers and atomic masses. The fourth tool, and we're moving here into territory of using these tools more and more rarely, is question marking. There's a button down at the bottom of the screen called Mark. Now, marking is a useful tool, but you need to practice with it to find out just how much you're going to use it on test day. Because even though it's useful, for instance, whenever you go to the section review, you'll be able to see which questions you've marked. So a really good reason to mark a question is if you choose an answer, but you're not 100% sure, you might want to check your math later on or do a little more passage research. that you mark that kind of question and then you come back to it at the very end of the section to do that extra research if you happen to have the time. If you haven't already played around with the marking tool, you should start doing it right away whenever you're practicing in the test interface so that you can get used to it and find out how much you want to use it on test day. Most successful test takers do mark at least a question or two, the highest difficulty questions that they get a chance to assess in each section. And then there's the fifth tool, highlighting. You can highlight text in a passage or actually in a question stem as well by highlighting it, clicking and dragging, just like you would on any website or other computer application. After you've clicked and dragged over that text, there's a little highlighting button that pops up. You click that highlighting button and then the text is highlighted for that question, and it'll be highlighted whenever you come back to it as well. If you want to get rid of highlighting, you click on the text itself to unhighlight it. But mark my words, be careful with highlighting. It's really easy to get carried away with this tool. And that's one reason why, just like with question marking, you should start experimenting with this tool now if you haven't already. And with the next few section tests or practice exams or passage-based question sets that you do, you should experiment with different levels of highlighting to see what works best for your own thinking style through the exam. Maybe you like highlighting a topic sentence of a paragraph. Maybe highlighting big vocabulary words is useful. Maybe highlighting words you think you might forget but are still probably important is what you want to do. Maybe highlighting just won't work out for you at all, and instead you just stick to your passage outlines on your scratch work and don't really worry about the highlighting tool. You need to find how you use the highlighting tool. With this particular tool, no one else can really tell you what the most efficient way you can use it is, since it's so flexible. And really, don't be ashamed if you don't like using the tool at all. A lot of successful test takers don't use it at all. As a rule of thumb though, if you're highlighting any more than 10 to 20% of a passage, you're probably using it too much. So if you are somebody who likes to use a lot of highlighting, but you see yourself highlighting a lot, you should practice with dialing it back a little bit, and you'll probably find that reading passages becomes a little bit simpler for you. Allows you to move through those passages a little faster and get to the questions where the points lie. And those are the 5 main CBT tools that the MCAT test interface gives you. They're going to be old friends by the time you take the exam, if they aren't already. The second part of this lesson is going to get you the facts about MCAT clock management and a few of the best practices in managing that clock. Now ultimately, dealing with the clock on test day is going to be a lot like the highlighting tool, actually. Your clock management strategy is going to be your clock management strategy. You need to experiment with different levels of using scratch work, with different levels of how often you check the clock. But no matter what you do, you want to push yourself towards good habits that take advantages of the facts about the clock. That's why we're going to focus on those habits and those facts. There's a table here on the screen and in your book where you'll write good and bad habits about clock management specifically. Remember the timer in the lower left-hand corner on test day. But before we go through a few examples of good and bad habits, take a crack at filling this in on your own. Make sure you leave a little bit of space so you can fill in what's about to come up on the screen. But take a minute to fill in your own mind, fill in 2 good habits, things you want to be doing about the clock, and 2 bad habits, things you want to avoid doing about clock management strategy on the MCAT. So whatever you wrote down yourself, consider them in relation to these, which are important takeaways as well. Things you absolutely must do in managing the clock on the MCAT is to pace yourself. Every MCAT section and the MCAT as a whole is really long, so you've got to find a way to spend about the same amount of time on every passage, even though there are 9 or 10 passages per section. This is the ultimate goal of clock management. Spend the right amount of time on the right questions for you. But between now and then, you need to hone your strategy. In the same way as you will with highlighting, you need to practice on your next full-length exam. Do you look at the clock every passage? Do you look at it 2 times per passage? What is going to make you most comfortable and keep you on track the most? And how does that interact with the CBT tools? Does highlighting or using the section review increase or decrease the amount of time that you spend on a given passage? On the other hand, things you want to definitely avoid both on test day and in the process of this is just worrying about the clock. There are a lot of MCAT students who are fixated on the clock. They look at it too much. So if anything, as you're practicing different clock management strategies, make sure you give a fair shot to not looking at the clock very often. One strategy I recommend if you haven't tried it yet is to look at the clock when you start a passage, look at the clock when you finish the passage and move to the questions, and then look at the clock when you have one question left to decide if you want to skip that question. Other considerations, especially as you hone your strategy, are not to worry too much about what other people do. You're probably studying in some kind of study group or some study class with a lot of other people preparing for the MCAT, but don't let them boss you around about how often you should look at the clock or how much you should stress out about time management. You should take tips from them if you can, share your successes, but remember, you ultimately need to find your own terms for this strategy. And don't overthink all of those CBT tools. Remember that even though there are tools to manage the clock and there are tools in the computer-based system, your ultimate goal is to get questions right and do it quickly. With these types of strategies that are so personal, don't force yourself to do anything just because someone else, one of your friends, told you is the right thing. Oh, you gotta highlight the first word of every paragraph or something like that. Find your own way. Try out your friends' ways, but if they don't work for you, keep on trying other ones. So we've seen general guidelines about good and bad things to do as you're preparing to get ready for the clock on test day. But there are also a few things you want to walk away from this lesson having memorized. And that's the basic facts about how much time you have for every question and every passage on a section. Those are laid out on this page in your book and the next one. First, there are the science sections. The science sections, that's Chem Phys, Bio Biochem, and Psych Soc, they have discrete questions. 15 discrete questions, and the first thing you should do is do those discrete questions. You do discrete questions first because they will be easier on average than passage-based questions, and you will be able to move through them more quickly. So you should click through an entire section from front to end doing only the discrete questions, then start back at the beginning and do the passage-based questions. By the time you finish that first pass, you should be about 15 minutes into the section. Then that will leave you 8 minutes for every passage, which you should divide into 3 minutes of reading and outlining and 5 minutes for the questions. And since there are 4 to 5 questions per passage, that's about 1 minute per question. Not that hard to remember, 1 minute per question. Things are similar, but a little different for the cars section. On the cars section, it's just passages. And 90 minutes for 9 passages is a pretty easy math problem. It's 10 minutes per passage. For cars, you should divide that into 4 minutes to read, a little longer because the passages are a little longer in the cars section, and then 6 minutes for the questions, which again, because there are about 6 questions per passage, is about 1 minute per question. So those are the basic facts. No matter what your individualized strategy is, for the science sections, you do the discrete questions first, then spend 8 minutes per passage. For the cars section, you spend 10 minutes per passage. Now, on the next page in your book, there is this wonderful diagram, which is something you can take to the bank. This table is the bedrock of every successful clock management strategy, because your timer on test day is going to start at 95 minutes for the science sections and 90 minutes for the cars section, and then it's going to count down. So even though on the cars section, you're going to spend about 10 minutes, hopefully a little less, on the first passage, the important number is not 10 minutes. The important number for you to remember is 80 minutes, because it's going to be counting down from 90, not up from 0. That means these numbers for the cars section, just intervals of 10 from 90 minutes all the way down to 0. And for the science sections, first jumping 15 minutes from 95 down to 80 for the discretes, and then going by multiples of 8 from 80 to 72 down to 64 and so on, down to 8 minutes and 0 minutes for the science sections. These numbers need to be at your command on test day in order to know how on track you are at any given time. And you could just memorize these numbers and know them as you move through every passage. But here's another thing you can do, and you should try this on your next full length. The moment you sit down to take the test and you get your scratch paper in front of you, write down these numbers. Right at the very top of the page, 95, then 80, 72, 64, 56, count down in 8s all the way down to 0, so that those numbers are right in front of you. They're stored on the page rather than in your mind, and it leaves your mind a little more space to do all that remembering science and strategizing you're going to have to do on those sections on the test. But before we end this lesson, a pop quiz. I told you it was important to memorize how long you're going to spend on the passage and on the questions. So without turning back to the previous page, answer right now. For the science sections, you get 8 minutes per passage. For the cars sections, you get 10 minutes. How much time of those 8 and 10 minutes should you be spending on the passage versus the questions? Try to write them down from memory in your book right now. So here's the answers. For the science sections, remember with 8 minutes, you're going to spend 3 minutes reading the passage and 5 minutes answering questions. And for the cars section, you're going to spend 4 minutes reading the passage and 6 minutes answering questions. It's always 1 minute per question, on average, of course. And that's the end of this little foray into the physical experience of test day. What tools do you use in the test interface, and how are you going to manage the clock? How are you going to use your scratch work and your knowledge of the test to succeed in those aspects? Remember that what links these two topics together is that you're going to have to find your own individualized strategy. So right now, if you haven't been already, you got to start experimenting with these tools and experimenting with different clock management strategies. Use the facts about them as a base and then see what works best for you. And it's going to get you a better score by having you more confident and better managed on the exam. Good luck.